Are we live? This has an incredible feeling of like late night with David Letterman right now. There's lights, there's cameras.
We don't see everything.
There's an amazing panel. We need an applause sign. Can we have a quick applause? Thank you all for your patience. Oh, this is going to be easier than I thought. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to be your host for this plenary session. This is the conversation on 20 years since Cairo and Beijing. To what extent have men been engaged? My name is Todd Minerson, and I'm the executive director of the White Ribbon Campaign based in Canada. I also have a couple of other hats that I wear. I'm a member of the Secretary General's Network of Male Leaders to End Violence Against Women, and I'm also a member of UN Women's Global Civil Society Advisory Group. And I think it's because of all of those different hats that I was asked to moderate this panel today. And I should correct myself, it's not a panel. This is a moderated discussion, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. But first, let me introduce our participants. Immediately to my left is Yoni van de Sand, who you've seen around at the opening and is the coordinator for Men Engage. To her left is my good friend and inspiration, Bandana Rana, who is from Sati in Nepal and is a gender justice, women's human rights activist for quite some time. To her left, Ms. Lakshmi Puri, who's the Deputy Executive Director for UN Women. And on her left is Ambassador Grete Gunnarsdottir, the permanent representative for Iceland. And to her left is Kate Gilmore, who you can't see right now, because she is in transit and will effortlessly join us in progress as the panel continues today. I was asked to do this and participated in many calls between my home city and New York, and I was given a very explicit set of instructions to follow, and I want to share those with you because I am not going to be responsible for compromising those things. So first of all, as I mentioned, number one, this is not a panel. This is a moderated discussion. So what we will be doing is having a 5-minute intervention from our participants, and then we will be having a conversation on the stage, and at the end of the session, we'll be inviting all of you to contribute as well. Number three, we need you to be part of this conversation. One of the other instructions that I was given, which is number 4, is that we have to come out of this with some concrete suggestions and ideas for how to engage men and boys in the post-2015 framework. So we're going to need your help based on the conversation and the reflections that we have up here. So that is my charge, and I will do my very best to make sure that we stick to it. I should also say, in order to do that, I'm going to be using a timer on the interventions from the participants. So after the timer goes up, if you hear a little dee-dee-dee, I don't want to see a whole room full of people going for their cell phone in their pocket. This is just my timer up here, and that will help keep us on schedule to meet all of those objectives. So to set the stage, I'd like to actually ask you all to take a bit of a journey with me. One that started in Cairo 20 years ago, moved to Beijing, and then took us to the point where UN Women has launched a campaign called He for She in 2014, engaging men and boys in ending gender-based violence and promoting gender equality. And if we think about this as quite a journey from 30,000, mostly women in Beijing in 1995 to this program intervention designed to get to men, what we want to do today is look at that journey in a bit more detail. And we want to understand, what was the road like? Where were the bumps? Where were the challenges? What were the successes? What were the landmarks that we need to stop and reflect along that happened along the way? And what we also want to do is have a look ahead. Where does the journey go from here? What does engaging men and boys look like in the post-2015 framework? Are we all sharing the same car? Or as men, are we still worried about chrome and horsepower and things like that? Is there enough room for everybody on this journey moving ahead? Those are the kinds of things that we want to talk about in this conversation today. And the way that we're going to start it is we're going to have Yoni come up and share some work that's been done between Men Engage and UN Women on men masculinities and changing power. It's a discussion on engaging men since Beijing. So Yoni, over to you. Oh, I will wait till you get to your first slide.
Okay. Just see how I'm going to do this. Okay, hello everyone. So I'm going to present a discussion paper that Todd just mentioned. That was a project together with Men Engage in collaboration with UN Women and support of UNFPA. Okay, I am going to hold them up. We have them in English and Spanish, and you got them in your bags. So the Beijing Platform for Action Plus 20, we've seen incredible advances over the last 20 years in especially in women's empowerment and rights, but it's not nearly good enough. And we really set the stage in the paper in the first box, page 11, where it gives an overview of the persisting gender inequalities and especially women's rights violations that continue in the world today. So the Beijing Platform for Action set a transformative agenda for gender justice, and it addresses underlying causes. And what we're calling for in the next phase is to engage men and boys as a critical piece for advancing the gender equality agenda, because it's necessary to challenge the structures, the beliefs, the practices, and the institutions that sustain men's aggravated privileges, to address inequalities between women and men, and also among women and among men. The discussion paper seeks to start a dialogue, which is what we're doing here today on stage, about forwarding these efforts to actively engage men and boys in challenging power dynamics in their own lives as well as in their communities and in societies. So there's increasingly widespread agreement that working with men and boys is a necessary part of achieving gender equality. There's more stakeholders, there's more variety, there's, like I said yesterday, there's over 700 member NGOs of Men Engage at the moment. The Commission of the Status of Women in 2014 had 18 side events on engaging men and boys. UN Women launched its He for She campaign, and there was a target proposed on engaging men and boys in the post-2015 agenda, and unfortunately that has been taken out, and we really want to have it back in. Recommendations. So align the work with men and boys vis-à-vis women's movements and efforts towards gender equality. We have to ensure that women's leadership and voices remain the backbone of feminist discourse in these shared spaces, but in cooperation with men and boys. And there has to be reflection on the part of men and boys who are working in these feminist movements on their own uses of gender-based power, even within those movements. And those working with men need to oppose actively anti-feminist groups and movements. So we see increasingly visible backgrounds by organized groups such as men's rights groups, fundamentalist groups. And we want to say they're a minority, but they are visible. They are sometimes really actively visible in the gender equality field, and men working in these fields have to actively oppose them. Our first recommendation is to reframe the message. We have to shift our normative understanding of men's roles within the broader agenda for gender equality. Women's empowerment itself is essential, but simultaneously we must engage men and boys to redistribute power, because men also have a responsibility. And framing gender equality as something men have a stake in, that they can actually benefit from, that they are not only the ones to blame, but that they have something to gain as well. There's a need for more research on what kind of strategies are actually working and what makes men already change. There's a lot of men who are working out gender equal behaviors in their daily life, so what makes them do that? 2, alliance building. We have to build and act through shared understandings and alliances between men's work for gender equality and the women's rights fields, as well as social justice movements. And there's a lot of intersecting issues that we have to work on, such as gender, class, caste, age, social orientation, and gender identity. These have to be part of a collaborative social movement. There has to be ongoing dialogue, and whatever we do in the field of working with men and boys for gender equality, we have to do it planning it and consulting with women's groups who have been doing the work for a long time, and with other progressive social movements as well. Recommendation number 3, upscaling programs to policies. We have to take the work with men from the program and the project level, which is very relevant in and by itself, but into policies and institutions. If we want to really accelerate change, we have to make the personal change into the structural change, and that requires reaching out to larger numbers of men and boys. We have to change systems and institutions, because what you see is in schools, in the health sector, in the workplace, there are spaces where gender norms are created, so we have to work on gender justice in those areas through working with men and boys. And we have to mobilize men who are in leadership roles to join our movement and also hold them accountable for the fact that they are in leadership positions, and so they have to step up and make their voices heard, that they want to work for gender justice and they want to involve men and boys. Number 4, implementation. Develop, implement and monitor policies to engage men in gender equality and to build state capacity to implement them. So we have to push forward, we have to advocate. We really have to do lobby and advocacy work with institutions and governments. We have to reform policies as well as legal institutions. We have to train staff in order to implement this kind of work that we're doing at the advocacy level. And we have to continue doing public awareness raising campaigns to change perceptions of gender roles. In the study itself, you will find concrete policy recommendations for different kind of thematic areas, such as gender-based violence, education, fatherhood and caregiving, and women's economic empowerment. And unfortunately, as you see, I'm trying to do this very fast. I was not able to show all of them here. So I want you to say, just want to say, this is really the moment. We're at a crucial moment in time. 2015 is coming up, the new development agenda, and let's do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoni. Thank you, Yoni. I know we did give you an impossible task to summarize the report in 5 minutes or less, but you did a fantastic job. And we're going to get back to some of those concrete recommendations in our conversation as well. And what I'd like to do now is invite Vandana to, would you like to use the podium? Please do. Share some of the experience of Beijing and some thoughts on her years of activism and work in the field.
Thank you, Todd. Good evening, everyone. You can't imagine how exciting and thrilling it is to be here 20 years after Beijing, to be speaking to this very important gathering, and honored to be able to share some of my experiences in regard to being in Beijing and the focus on working with men and boys engagement. Exactly 20 years ago, I attended a conference. It was not the Beijing conference. That was in 1994 in Bangkok, Women Empowering Communication. And that was a preparatory meeting for Beijing. I worked in the media at that time, had just entered the media field and was not in activism at all. But the kind of deliberations that were made there aroused my interest. But I somehow felt a misfit because you needed to be engaged or belong to a women's movement to be there. That's how I felt. Very few men and very few deliberations focused on engaging men and boys, but there was some recognition and some presentations on the need for involving men, particularly focused on because men are obstacles, for promoting gender equality. That is the understanding that I got from this Women Empowering Communication, but it triggered this interest in me to follow this activism, and I was fortunate enough to attend the Beijing conference in 1995. The biggest learning for me in 1995 was the immense number of women, more than 30,000 there, the collective strength, the collective voice that we all had for promoting gender equality and ending gender-based violence. And I think that is where my journey was triggered off as continuing to be an advocate for gender equality and promoting, and ending this, addressing gender-based violence. That's my activism, how it started. What I feel is that in relation to men's focus on men and boys engagement in Beijing, though, like I said, I was a very young activist, so I didn't have access to most of the formal negotiations and processes that went along. I was trying to comprehend what happens. You know how it is. I'm still learning. I don't seem to get enough of it. So I spoke, before coming here, I spoke to a few elderly senior women activists who had been in the process of negotiations and asked them what they thought. How did this men engagement or focus on men and boys work emerged in Beijing? And I spoke to a number of them, and they felt that at that time, though there was a clear recognition amongst all women that there is a need to engage men, but there was also this uncertainty. There was also this feeling of being unsure. How would it come up? Would that mean that the women's space would be shrinking? Would that mean that the men would actually take over the women's movement, and the little domain that we had also we had to forsake? These were also some of the apprehensions and questions that women who were in the negotiating table had. But in spite of that, they had a critical understanding, a very clear understanding and recognition that men and boys need to be engaged. And for the first time, in spite of these apprehensions, the Beijing Platform for Action came up with a very broadened framework of men not just as problems, but using men or potentially tapping on or engaging men and boys actively as part of the solutions. That was the first time that came formally in the Beijing Platform for Action. Of course, ICPD had also addressed this in 1994, but more focused on engaging men and boys to change the lives of communities and societies, particularly related to health, and particularly related to sexual and reproductive health education. So that was broadened in the Beijing Platform for Action. That's what I think. But so my personal journey started from there. But what did I do to engage men and boys, or most of us women who are in activism do to engage men and boys after the post-Beijing? After the post-Beijing, yes, there have been discussions, as Yoni also said in her deliberations. If you look at the international meetings and commitments, if you look at the World Social Development meeting, as well as the Beijing +5, as well as the CSW 48 that happened, the HIV/AIDS special session, all of that had focused very much on the engagement of men and boys after the post-Beijing, and has elaborated the recognition in these commitments as well. Where programs are concerned, I think most of us, we have conducted programs, we have conducted projects where we engage men and boys. But these have been very nominal, and these have been limited in, they have very limited access to the number of people that we reach, the number of men and boys that we reach. And they have been more as engaging men as beneficiaries or partners. That's what we have mostly done. And so the progress has been very uneven, and the change has been very, very slow, in spite of the Beijing Platform for Action having this. The momentum was so exciting, having this very, very formal commitment on engaging men and boys. The progress has been extremely uneven, and the change also has been very, very slow. So what is it that we, there are, and I actually read that report also, there are 2 or 3 notions. We have looked at men as gatekeepers at some times, which actually reaffirms the notion of patriarchy. On the other hand, we have also talked about men as allies and partners, where even in Nepal and in South Asia, in most cases, my own experience, the scope is there, the environment is there, response is there. They have been spelled out in policies and papers, but we're actually reaching it out to the institutional and policy level. We have not made that transformation. That's what we feel we need to, in the coming days, we need to make that transformative change, that we do not limit engagement of men and boys to just partners and allies or to projects and programs, but take it up to the level of policy and institutional change. I think that is the kind of change that we are looking up to in the coming years. So this is what I feel has been the challenges, and in the coming years we also need to look at. Most of the programs have sort of felt that, like, oh, we have done it, for the women, yes, we have done it. Look at the paper, it's in the policy. It's like doing a favor. The men that have been engaged, predominantly most of the men or the institutions of men that have been engaged, is looking at it as more as a favor for women. This is what we have done it for it. It's in the papers, rather than a responsibility of themselves. So I think that needs to change. Men needs to be actively engaged to challenge the power dynamics within themselves, in their lives, and in the lives of in the communities and the societies. And I think that this Delhi Symposium will create that pathway, will make that headway, because yesterday the UN Women Director said, if not Delhi, where else? It's the largest democratic country, over here we are, and I'm sure we'll make that change, and all of us will be a part of that change. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Vandana. A great look at some of those initial feelings around, I wish I could have been there for those conversations about, should we invite the men's? This is a really critical time, and I think it's fascinating that you're able to share some of that perspective. I'd like to ask Ambassador Gunnarsdottir to come up now and share from a state perspective where we can go and where we've come from in terms of engaging men and boys.
Yes, thank you, and really thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting. I'm supposed to talk about the role of government, and I've been attending some of the meetings here during this conference, and what I find missing from the discussion so far is that I hear very few people mentioning women's rights as human rights, and that this is a human rights issue, and this is something, you know, that we remind ourselves again and again at the UN. I mean, that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And it changes the discussion, because especially when it comes to government, when we are talking about human rights issues, it's not a choice but an obligation to implement human rights. And we have, when we look at governments, most countries are state parties to at least a number of the human rights treaties, and they all have non-discrimination clauses, including as far as sex is concerned. And also when we go further and we go into CEDAW, and there we have mentioning the engagement of men and boys, and almost all member states are parties to CEDAW, and there we are again talking about legal obligations. We are not talking about these political commitments. But then when we go further, and that is the topic of this meeting, is Beijing and Cairo, and there we have political commitments, including to engage men and boys. So I just think this is important, at least when we are talking about governments, and also when we are talking about the role of men and boys, because at least from where I am coming from, I look at this as something that everybody should participate in realizing human rights. And if we were talking about racism, I think we would all agree that everybody should be working on eliminating racism, and that is our obligation, both government and all of us. And the same goes for gender equality and to eliminate discrimination on the basis of sex. It's an obligation, and we really should, all of us, look at this at it as our responsibility to participate, and I would like to see that more sort of a part of the conversation. And but being a government representative, I just wanted to touch upon slightly what we in Iceland have been doing, both at the national and the global level, and I will just take some examples because there is not much time here, but you might know that Iceland has been on the top of the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index now for 6 years, and with the Nordic countries following closely behind. And the main reasons for us being on the top of this index is political participation and high level of education and equal access to healthcare in my country, as well as women's participation in the labor market is above 80%. And there are various measures that we have taken in Iceland that have led to, for example, that we have over 80% of women in the labor force, and that includes having changed the school days into continuous days, so there are no breaks that exist in a lot of countries where usually the wife then stays at home to receive the kids during lunch or something. But we have a continuous school day. We also have a universal pre-K program, which is now available for children as early as 12 months. And 95% of Icelandic children between 2 and 5 are in preschool. And this sort of, it helps to remove the stereotyped role of men and women when it comes to the caretaking role. I also wanted to mention, because I think that is the biggest step that we have taken in Iceland, and I know it would be a challenge for a lot of other countries to do that, but it is the parental leave, where we allot 3 months to the mother and 3 months to the father, and then there are additional 3 months that they decide among themselves who is going to take. And the 3 months for each, the mother and the father, are non-transferable. So it is either to use it or lose it, as we say. And close to 90% of men in Iceland, of fathers in Iceland, are actually using this opportunity to go on paternal leave. And this has led to building a closer relationship with their children, and women and men are very much on equal footing in the workplace because of this measure. It's been extremely important. And this has also led to that on a personal level, it is visible how much more commitment there is on behalf of fathers towards their children and other caretaking issues and so on in my country. Now, I also wanted to just slightly say, because we are also talking about at the global level, and with Iceland, because we will enter into a discussion on post-2015 a bit later, and we did try to introduce a target on the role of men and boys during the negotiations in the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. It was thrown out. It was felt that even it had quite a lot of support, but it was thought that it wasn't operational. It was difficult to measure. So it is our intention to try to reintroduce this when we start again in January, and we will need some help both from other member states and from the civil society. So, but because we really think this is doable, but we just have to find ways to demonstrate that this is measurable. That is really, I think, the trick here. And finally, I want to mention, you're already beeping?
Yes, but go ahead.
Okay, no, I'll mention that in the discussion. So okay. Just thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. So let us officially welcome Kate Gilmore, Deputy Executive Director of UNFPA. I don't know how many, put a hand up here if you've spent some time in Delhi traffic this week. Anybody put a hand up? I don't know what strings Kate pulled to get here, but it must have been pretty magical in that drive, so thank you for making the effort. We're going to do a little change in the order in order to give Kate a moment to catch her breath, and I'll invite Lakshmi Puri now to come up and talk on her comments for this panel.
Thank you. Indeed, we are talking about norms and standards at the global level, and many of you practical people, those foot soldiers and generals on the ground, must wonder often why we are talking about them. But they have really a very strong impact. And the speakers who spoke before me, they talked about why in trying to explain what and how. And that's why I think our panel and I would like to record that this meeting is taking place at a historic moment in terms of the normative and the norms and standard setting, and also in terms of recalling, recommitting to norms and standards that have been adopted by the international community in the last 20 years. The first of those confluences is the back to the future of Beijing plus 20. As was recalled by Bandana 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, at Beijing, at the Fourth World Conference, the Beijing Platform for Action was adopted. And that set the framework, among which, of course, the important issue or important principle, the grounding and founding principle of women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's right was set. To look at the rights lens of the whole gender equality, women's empowerment framework. Strategic objectives were established and actions identified. So 20 years from them, in commemorating, in reviewing and appraising the implementation of Beijing, we are trying to see how, unfortunately or fortunately, they are still relevant 20 years later, if not more relevant, and also how we can accelerate and make more effective its implementation. And the other historic conjunction is the MDGs are coming to the end of their the deadline period next year, and the international community is engaged in launching what is, for the first time ever, once in a century opportunity. If not, many talk about once in a generation, once in a lifetime. I would say once in a century opportunity of a universal, an integrated, comprehensive, sustainable development agenda and transformative, not business as usual. And I think our executive director keeps talking about this, how it cannot be, and the new normal, and the new norms that we need to set at every level, international, regional, national,